for joining us for this short series of recordings on abuse prevention. In these recordings, we provide a brief overview of effective child abuse prevention and Oregon's unique infrastructure that is helping make abuse and violence prevention possible. This is episode 2 of 3. Building on the framework for prevention that we discussed in episode 1, these next 2 episodes are going to dive deeper into the understanding that effective prevention requires addressing root causes and promoting healthy and safe alternatives. In this episode, we specifically look more at oppression as the root cause of abuse and neglect and explore how to address these roots in our prevention efforts. For more resources on this and preventing multiple forms of violence and abuse across the lifespan, please visit SATF's website or reach out to our prevention team. Today, you are hearing the voices of 2 of SATF's prevention team. I am Nicole Cunningham, Abuse Prevention Coordinator at the Sexual Assault Task Force, and my pronouns are she and hers.
And I am Meg Foster. I also use she, her pronouns, and I am the Prevention Program Coordinator at the Sexual Assault Task Force. Before we jump in, just like all of the other videos in this series, we're using a couple of visual cues that we wanted to remind you of. So one of those is this yellow light bulb in a round circle, which refers to another resource that may be useful for you that we're not really diving into in this presentation, but we wanted to cue for you so you can do more learning or access those for support in your efforts. Additionally, you might see throughout the presentations a little green or teal or blue box in the bottom right-hand corner here. And this refers to a page in SATF's Comprehensive Prevention Toolkit. So TK stands for toolkit, and then the number is the page of the toolkit. So if you want to access that toolkit on our website, or if you have a hard copy with you, you can follow along in these presentations by looking at that number in the corner and referring to that page in the toolkit. As Nicole just mentioned, in order to effectively prevent abuse and multiple forms of violence across the lifespan, we have to address the root causes of that violence and abuse and promote healthy norms. Today, we really want to dive a little bit deeper into those root causes and what that means so that we can best implement prevention programming.
So what are the root causes that we are focusing on today? At the task force, we believe that the answer is oppression in all of its different forms. We'll offer a working definition of oppression on the next slide, but we really want to take a moment and ground us in the understanding of how oppression works and why it works so effectively. We're talking about things like racism, sexism, ageism, adultism, and transphobia when we say oppression. When we boil all these things down, basics, we can see that at the core of oppression is the understanding that there is something about a specific person or a specific group of people that makes them less than in the eyes of the oppressor. Maybe this is their age, their race, their ability, their religion, their socioeconomic standing, or something else. What matters is that there's an implicit understanding within the oppressor, maybe they learned it from the media or their family or their own experience, they have power over the oppressed and that this makes sense or is supported by the climate or circumstances that they are operating in. This framework of understanding and accepting that some people are better than others allows for attitudes and behaviors that center the comfort and safety of the oppressor over the oppressed. Ideas turn into words, which turn into actions, which turn into norms, and so on. Oppression very effectively creates a system where individuals are learning the foundations of violence and abuse and to be capable of violence in the name of what they deem as right, true, or good. We must address oppression as it exists in our work, within ourselves, or we risk perpetuating these harmful ideas, systems, and behaviors. We can think of our work to dismantle oppression like knocking the foundation out from under the pyramid of violence, which we'll see later on in this presentation.
So we want to offer a more technical definition of oppression. This comes from the Oregon Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. They offer us oppression is the systematic and pervasive mistreatment of individuals on the basis of their membership in a disadvantaged group. It involves an imbalance of power and one group benefiting from the systemic exploitation of other groups. It occurs on several levels: interpersonal, cultural, institutional, and structural. And we'll take a look at those levels in just a moment, but just wanted to name, so often when we think about oppression, we often think about it in terms of an individual's actions or behaviors. But I really want to cue us to that systematic piece, that there are so many pieces here that are influencing us without our knowledge. Nicole really offered that reframe of when we're learning to value some people less than other people, we're learning the foundations of violence, but that learning isn't always very clear to us. It's not always explicit to us. This is, the water that we are swimming in, and we have to learn like what is problematic, what is oppressive, what is bad water, and what is good water. And sometimes it's just waking up to the water that we're swimming in and not just, thinking about individuals and their individual actions and beliefs.
So taking a closer look at the levels that are illustrated here, we can start to understand some of the different places where oppression can manifest and shift the way that we think and act toward each other. These levels correspond to the socio-ecological model that we became familiar with in the episode 1 of this series. Looking at the personal level here, we can understand that these are things like values, beliefs, and feelings that we have toward or about ourselves and others. The interpersonal level starts to think more about how we communicate with each other and what we do or how we act in our relationships and interactions. The institutional level is where things like rules, laws, policies, and procedures can really help to cement oppression into the fabric of our society and into the structures that we have to navigate for things like education and healthcare, criminal justice, workplaces, etc. Finally, the cultural level helps us think about how oppression can be sewn into the fabric of the things that tie us together on a human level. This level looks at what we think of as beautiful, what we think of as the truth, and what we believe is right, as just a few examples.
Yeah, thank you, Nicole. And again, these things might not always feel very explicit to us. They might be a lot more about the impact of the work we do that we're not aware of. And thinking about, for example, the institutional level with those rules, policies, and procedures, that there are oftentimes rules or policies that we enact in our organizations that are well-intentioned, but aren't necessarily rooted in the most informed or thoughtful or inclusive ways. And so thinking about these pieces, right? Like this is, again, that water that we're swimming in. And a big part of our role in addressing the root causes of violence and abuse is looking for those spaces where we might be perpetuating those. Understanding oppression at these different levels means also understanding dynamics like privilege, power, and prejudice that uphold and are enacted by systems of oppression. These elements often make it harder to address oppression and are regularly used to deny the existence or realities of oppression. This is particularly true when we're looking at things like institutional policies or laws or those cultural norms, things about what is beautiful, what is truthful, what is right. Those things that are so deeply ingrained in our society that we often don't question them, that we deny that they're all alternatives, or that, those things are actually oppressive. For these reasons, if we truly want to prevent and address violence, we have to take a deeper look at the elements of prejudice and power and privilege as well. The importance of these elements are often simplified using a version of the following equation. Prejudice plus power equals oppression. And you might also see this written as like privilege plus power, but that privilege is a really important piece because when it is coupled with prejudice and then that power is added in is where we get oppression. So it's almost like privilege plus prejudice equals one thing. And when you add that to power, but prejudice in general with power equals oppression. This formula creates systems that discriminate against some groups and benefit other groups. These are often referred to as the isms or different forms of oppression.
Thank you, Meg. So let's take some time here to think about what the isms are and what we're talking about when we're thinking about these different forms of oppression. So we wanted to briefly give a little more depth about what some of the different forms look like. So for example, you'll see here that adultism is the bias and discrimination that adults and social institutions, think things like schools, healthcare, the legal system, etc., demonstrate against young people on account of their youth. I won't read each of these for the sake of time, but I'll highlight a few that aren't expanded on here with these written definitions, such as cissexism, which is the prejudice or discrimination against transgender people in favor of cisgender people, or those whose sense of personal identity and gender corresponds with their assigned sex at birth. One more that I'll highlight is sizeism, which is discrimination or prejudice directed against people because of their size, and especially because of their weight. So what we can see here as a thread between each of these different isms is that there is some identity factor, some piece of who someone is that is being discriminated against, or where prejudice is attached to interactions with those identities. So on this next slide, we want to take a moment here, now that we have an understanding of what oppression is and how it creates opportunities for discrimination, prejudice, and violence. So what does that tell us about how it shows up in circumstances of abuse, as we have to recognize it before we can effectively prevent it or dismantle it? Something that you may or may not know about me is that I used to be a Child Protective Services caseworker for the state of Oregon. I've had lots of experience with getting to see how oppression is showing up, and beyond that, really getting to talk to adults and young people about why they act the way they do, or how certain ideas, actions, and behaviors impacted them in their experience of abuse. From my time working with hundreds of families over the years, I have identified 3 different places where we can really circle in to think about oppression. These 3 places are listed on this slide. So the first one that I wanted to highlight here is this piece of a root cause for the behavior of the person who causes harm. So a little more context here. When we're looking at this particular place, we're talking about the ideas, the values, the things that are ingrained in the person who causes harm. So maybe the parent, maybe the coach, maybe a neighbor, right? Whoever it is who is perpetuating harm, what are the things that they learned and internalized growing up, or from the media, from their parents, whatever it is, that have created in them this understanding that they can cause harm to someone else based on their identity factors. The second way that we can look at this is as a tool that's used to cause harm. So as someone who is causing harm, how can someone use things like ableism or racism or classism to make the person who they are trying to harm feel like they are powerless, or like they're less valuable, or that they don't have the skills or support or tools that they need to advocate for themselves? And then the third place is thinking about how oppression is reinforced by our systems and structures. So this is looking at what happens after someone has experienced harm, and maybe there's, as a result, a child welfare investigation or a police investigation, or there's a medical response. What things happen during that process, and what is built into those structures might reinforce oppression? For example, if we have, let's say, a transgender youth who experiences harm and they go to a medical provider for care afterward, there is no provider there who has the ability to provide comprehensive and appropriate care for transgender youth. What does that say about what our system values when it comes to whose care is prioritized and whose care is important? So with that said,
those are such great examples. And that last one there too, of it as it is reinforced by our systems and structures. Just wanted to note as well, based on those levels that you talked about earlier, Nicole, that that doesn't necessarily have to be just after harm has occurred, right? And thinking about some of the ways in which we are broadly, the broad we here, are trying to maybe restrict access to certain folks in our K-12 schools. There have been a lot of efforts lately that make our K-12 schools less safe for students who maybe are trans or who identify as part of the LGBTQ+ and trans communities. And recognizing that those efforts that restrict access and make our schools less safe for youth who are trans or part of the LGBTQ+ communities, that we are making it less likely for them to access support as well. So there are so many examples there too of there were some efforts in the state a while ago to pass some laws around age of consent to around sex and sexuality, and folks weren't adjusting the age of consent, which in Oregon is 18, but they were trying to make it so folks as young as 12 can seek out information and talk about sex and sexuality. But we also know statistically that a lot of people that are navigating their gender identities and their sexual orientations, that starts younger than 12. And so if those people, if an 11-year-old, if a 10-year-old were to ask questions about their gender identity or sexual orientation, how the law was framed some folks were interpreting it as that would require a mandatory report, which is not what we want to have happen when it's like a young person is like, I maybe don't feel like I align with the gender assigned to me at birth. And so those ways in which our systems and structures make it less safe for some people to navigate them, to access supports, to find and seek help, or think that like help is available to them because we've set up barriers.
Thank you so much for that addition, Meg. That's incredibly important and also so accurate, right? Because we know that access is one of the really important pieces of whether or not somebody will experience harm or not, based on what access they have to services. And so thank you for highlighting that and for making that connection to, this isn't just things that happen after violence or abuse has occurred. Really, what does it mean for our systems and our structures to set up environments that are safer and more likely for people to access them? So thank you. That's a great addition. On this next slide here, we want to think about an example of how oppression causes harm. And this is really just a way to help us conceptualize and bring home the understanding of how oppression turns into abuse in the real world. So this is an example of how ableism became emotional abuse for this couple. I'll go ahead and read the example here. So Joe experiences multiple mental health conditions. Joe's partner, Sam, learned from their family growing up that mental health is not something to be talked about and is something to be ashamed of. Sam is not supportive of Joe seeking mental health treatment and gets mad at Joe when they show symptoms of their mental health conditions. Joe learns from Sam that it's not okay to need help and starts to believe that Sam is right when they say there is something wrong with them and that no one else would put up with Joe's behaviors or love them if they left. So we can see here that Sam has internalized ableist ideas that have made them think that having a mental illness or mental health need is a weakness or something to be ashamed of, is bad, is wrong, etc. Sam learned these things from their family, and it's likely so deeply ingrained in them that they haven't questioned that prejudice, or maybe they really and truly believe that this is an accurate perception given the information that they have received in their life. Being in a romantic relationship comes with elements of power, as partners have the ability to build you up and support you, or to not do those things, and sometimes to go beyond that and cause harm to their partner. In this scenario, Sam, intentionally or not, caused harm to Joe with the internalized ableism that they displayed when talking about mental health and the impact that mental health has on Joe's behavior. Sam makes comments about how others wouldn't love Joe or deal with their mental health needs. Again, based on Sam's internalized view of mental health. And as such, have created a condition where Joe doesn't feel valued or like they can be their authentic self without risking the things that humans need from romantic relationships, like affection. This is where we see that ableism has become emotional abuse, as Sam is isolating Joe and trying to prevent them from seeking supports that will help keep Joe feeling healthy, happy, and safe.
Yeah, we can kind of summarize these dynamics of oppression using a tool called the pyramid of violence. And what this offers us is understanding that things that might seem small, these may be smaller, I'm air quoting, smaller acts of oppression, things like making jokes or like talking about people in a certain way might not seem that bad compared to like hate crimes or genocide. But for those other pieces, those bigger acts of violence to be possible, they have to be built on this foundation of increasing forms of violence, that genocide isn't possible unless we are creating norms and talking about people in a way that values them less than other people, even if it's through jokes, which are funny maybe to some people, but likely not to a lot of people. And so, right, those ways in which we are reinforcing norms of valuing some people less than other people. You can learn more about the pyramid of violence by checking out page 25 of the Comprehensive Prevention Toolkit. There's a lot of dynamics here that we can explore and understand, but this is just one visual to really help us understand how oppression is deeply connected across these different levels of violence. We also wanted to cue for you to learn more about these dynamics, a resource called The Characteristics of White Supremacy Culture, a really great resource to explore, particularly within our institutions, ways in which we might, be upholding that foundation of oppression and reinforcing violence and abuse in unintentional ways. With that in mind, we also just want to note that there is a pretty extensive history throughout the United States in particular, but including here in Oregon, that really has created norms and environments today that uphold oppression. And we want to make sure that we are learning about and taking time to dismantle those norms. And that means that we also have to understand the context with which those norms came to be. Things like, you know, historical racism against Latinx folks and farm workers in particular has led to a lot of efforts to restrict farm worker rights and not having access to things like, you know, paid family leave, a 40-hour work week, you know, overtime pay, health benefits, all of these things that, like, we know help prevent abuse. They help protect against violence that communities and individuals experience. And by not addressing that systemic and historical racism, we are unintentionally upholding abuse in our communities. And so there's this piece, right? Like, if we're not addressing oppression, if it's not a core part of our work, we're actually working against ourselves when it comes to preventing violence and abuse. We have to be incorporating these root causes approaches in order to more effectively and meaningfully prevent this violence and abuse. Another great example might be, you know, the ways in which we restrict voting rights for people under the age of 18, which is a really fascinating piece because people have a lot of opinions about kids and what they're ready for, but we also pass a lot of policy that directly impacts young people and don't give them a voice in that process, or don't give them an equal voice in that process. So, like, what are the ways in which we are, right, trying to support and uplift and protect young folks, but also maybe reinforcing oppression by devaluing them and devaluing their voices in those processes? There's a lot of history there. Just one more example as well, maybe around ableism, is that Oregon has a really long history with eugenics. We had a state board of eugenics into the 1980s, and that body forcibly sterilized over 2,000 people in the state of Oregon. And a lot of those were predominantly folks with mental health issues, as well as folks who were part of the LGBTQ and plus and trans communities. And so when we think about, right, like, this is a state body doing this, so why might people not trust state agencies offering help when they were, you know, not that long ago, this is less than 30 years ago, that folks were experiencing, or I guess about 30 years ago, that folks might have been experiencing, you know, forcible sterilization because the state deemed them, you know, not worthy of reproduction for whatever reason. And so there are a lot of these examples of history, and we encourage you all learn more about those and think about the ways that we might be unintentionally upholding some of those pieces in our policies, our practices, our laws. There are a lot of laws, for example, around sodomy that today we use very commonly in the abuse world, but were explicitly created to make it illegal to be gay. And we don't think about that. And so what is the harm that some of these things have caused our communities? You can learn more about Oregon's history and how oppression has informed our current structures and the barriers to prevention that we are navigating today, and where you might be able to plug into that by accessing our SATF's Addressing the Root Causes of Violence and Abuse online course. It's free, and there's a whole section in there to explore Oregon's history more meaningfully and how that might impact your work.
You so much for all of that, Meg. And you're absolutely right. Let's focus in here on this next slide on one particular example of oppression that exists in Oregon, so that we can really make the connections between how these historical programs are programs and policies and laws and norms and all of that, right? How those things influence present day situations of violence that are occurring. So we wanted to give you a really tangible example here so that we could think through this in a way that is kind of connecting those dots. So when we're looking at the example of racism, that spans the legacy and history of our state, right? Over the years, Oregon has displayed racism through laws, policies, programs, and more, just like Meg was saying, that have a lasting impact on our state today. A few examples of these include the Oregon Bracero program, increased hate crimes that we're seeing in recent years, Black exclusion laws in Oregon, treaty dynamics with Native Americans, a history of redlining in Oregon, Japanese internment, attempts to make English the official state language, density of white supremacist groups in Portland, and a racist jury system that allows for non-unanimous jury convictions of felony crimes. So with that framing, let's take a look at this example that we're looking here at how racism and classism become police violence. So in this example, Avery is Black and currently experiencing homelessness. On a number of occasions, Avery has had the police called on them for illegally camping or making others feel unsafe, in air quotes, even when Avery had not done anything wrong. Every time Avery has a police contact, it increases the negative perception that the police have of them. One day, Avery is detained by a police officer who has internalized the idea that Black people are more likely to become violent, due at least in part to a lifetime of consuming media, which presents Black and African Americans in this way. The officer believes, subconsciously or not, that Avery does not have the ability to advocate for themselves due to the lack of resources and credibility. When the officer detains Avery, he uses excessive force, as they believe that Avery is dangerous, resulting in injury to Avery. So this example demonstrates how racism turns into police violence as a result of having limited concern for the well-being of Avery. Again, coming back to that, some people are more valuable than others, learning the foundations of violence thing. As a Black person experiencing homelessness in Oregon, there's a good chance that Avery or their family/community have been impacted by things like redlining and gentrification, especially if the scenario is playing out in an urban area. We see the officer has internalized ideas about Black people and is projecting those prejudices onto Avery as a Black person. There is also a component of classism here, where the officer does not think that Avery has the ability to advocate for themselves because they have no money, no resources, no community, or whatever it is that the officer perceives. When we mix power with prejudice and add in that extra layer of little concern for ramifications, we can see how this scenario easily spirals into violence. So with that in mind, let's think a little bit about what are some of the impacts of oppression. As you can see on the slide here, there's a number of different ways that trauma is a result of oppression. Oppression has serious and significant consequences for those who experience it, the communities that support those who experience it, those who are working to address and dismantle it, as well as people who are close to and in relationships with someone who experiences oppression. We also see the impacts on things like the legacy and frameworks of our state, communities, and our country, as well as in the functioning of things like our medical system, our government, our education system, our child welfare system, our criminal justice system, and more. Oppression isn't a small thing that just goes away or that only impacts the person who is being oppressed. When one of us experiences this harm, many, if not all of us in the community or in the state or in the country, feel the impact and experience the harm and hurt that comes along with human suffering.
Building on those pieces and the impacts of oppression, one of the tools that we often use to talk about trauma is the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, so the ACEs study that was done some time ago and has been really valuable for helping us understand the ways in which certain factors can have lifelong impacts, including mental health and economic success and other pieces. The original studies of ACEs were predominantly done in white-dominated communities that were middle class. And what they've found since then is that a lot of times when the ACEs tools were used with communities of color or other groups that have experienced higher rates of oppression, that they started at the bare minimum was pretty high up on the ACEs scale. And that is really tied to, historical trauma, intergenerational trauma, and these forms of oppression, which is where we get to kind of the second pyramid, this one on the right. That ACEs gives us a really important starting place to think about trauma and how that might impact people that we are in community with. But we also want to add in these additional layers of historical trauma, intergenerational pieces, those systems and systemic oppression and how those have been enacted on families and communities throughout history, as well as social location. and those pieces of how we're valuing different people differently, especially whether that's explicit or not. And so adding in these other layers around trauma and social location really help us better serve and better address the abuse that's occurring in our communities.
So just to kind of circle back here with this ACEs conversation, I think it's really important that we are, thinking about the connection between how oppression exists and how it sets the stage for ACEs, just like Meg was talking about. So oppression leads to a lack of or different access to things like resources, housing, employment, community care, and education. These things are directly connected to the adverse childhood experiences that we are talking about when we're looking at the ACEs scale. These are known risk factors for experiencing abuse, right? Having lack of access, not having things you need, not being able to meet your needs, all of those things contribute to circumstances and environments where young people in particular are less safe. Everyone is less safe, right? When we don't have access to the things we need. So cycles of oppression keep people in cycles of abuse that we see primarily when we are doing child abuse work.
Absolutely. And this helps us understand that this trauma might manifest differently for different folks that we are serving, whether they have directly experienced child abuse or not. And it also helps us recognize that, like, if we are addressing different forms of oppression in our communities, then we are actively working to prevent not just those cycles of abuse, but harm that is experienced by everyone in our communities, whether we're recognizing that as harm or not. I think a great visual to also kind of think about this is the power and control wheel. This is something we use in the domestic and sexual violence sector quite a bit. We talk about these different forms of violence, these strategies that people might use to perpetuate or perpetrate violence. But I think it's really important to note that that power and control wheel is held together by these systems of oppression, as you can see on this example of the power and control wheel. This is the LGBTQ+ and trans power and control wheel. And we know that heterosexism, homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, cissexism, all of these pieces reinforce and uphold the strategies within this wheel to perpetuate and perpetrate violence and abuse. And so if we are dismantling the outsides of these wheels, it's really hard for that wheel to stay together. So we want to look to those places that, oppression is actively upholding violence and abuse as well.
When we're thinking about addressing oppression, we want to be able to think beyond individual actions toward the broader structures, like Meg is saying, that reinforce oppression in our work, sectors, and societies. When we better understand the larger context, we can better understand how our actions uphold or interrupt oppression and whether our approaches actually reinforce the violence we are trying to stop. This comes back to much of what we talked about in episode 1, about how our efforts do not exist in isolation, nor does oppression exist in isolation. Everything we do and every approach we take lands somewhere on the socio-ecological model between the individual level and the societal levels. We have to think about unintended consequences, ripple effects, and how what we are doing gets us either closer to or further away from the goals of health and safety for all people.
With that in mind, one of the things that can feel really challenging when it comes to addressing root causes is these are some really big picture ideas, right? They help us really contextualize the work that we're doing, but it can also feel really hard to find our role in this work. So we wanted to offer just a starting place for each of us in our, whether we are doing response work, whether we're doing prevention work, that anti-oppression is one of the key prevention strategies that all of us can utilize to interrupt abuse in our communities. And it might not be, right, I'm going and doing this traditional prevention program, but this is one of those places where we can all find our role in this work. And arguably we need to, if we actually are dedicated to trying to stop abuse from happening in the first place. So here are just a couple of ideas that might be helpful. be cognizant of your processes and products. This might mean taking more time to create things or do things. So often, right, we are working in this, like, we have to get everything done immediately. We have to be all things to everyone all the time, which means that we don't have a lot of time, or we don't feel like we have a lot of time to sit in whatever we're creating or whatever we're doing. And part of this piece of being cognizant of our processes and products is taking a step back and maybe dedicating more time to them. Yes, we might need this one pager today, but if we want this one pager not to uphold systems of oppression or ignore certain populations or ignore the harm that certain populations are doing, or maybe unintentionally reinforce the harm that certain populations are experiencing, we might want to take a step back and look at opportunities to really engage with and within communities to make sure that our products are inclusive and thoughtful and not upholding those structures and pieces of harm. I know that can feel really stressful because we are in this go, go, go instant gratification culture broadly. But this is a really important piece if we want to start working to make sure that we're not unintentionally upholding the pyramid of violence and those structures that allow for violence and abuse to happen. We want to acknowledge and shift power. This is also one of those places that can sometimes feel weird, is like, I don't have any power, or like, I earned this power, right? These weird places that we push back on this. But we want to look at the spaces where we can have power with one another versus power over one another. How are we using the power that we have? How are we using the privilege that we have so that we are not reenacting prejudice and therefore adding that with power and reinforcing oppression? And so, like, what are the places that we have power? You know, as someone who works in a statewide organization, I have some power. As a funder, I have some power. But as, you know, I'm not the boss. I also don't have power over, you know, all these organizations or all these places to do all the things. And so I recognize that there are places I don't have power, and I recognize that there are places that I do. So what are the places that I can meaningfully use the power that I have to dismantle structures and systems of oppression? And that takes work, right? That takes practice. It's not something we're all going to be good at overnight. Additionally, I recognize as a white person, I have a lot of privilege and power that some of my friends and colleagues don't have because they're not white and people value their voices in a different way than they value mine. I realize as an adult, I have privilege and power that, you know, my 10-year-old niece doesn't have. I can say something and people are going to listen to it in a way that they won't listen to it from her. Similarly, as a female identified person, and a female presenting person, there are places where people are more likely to listen to my male colleagues than they are to me. And so what are the places that we all have power, and how can we enact that? I know, for example, that my brother's friends are less likely to listen to my brother's little sister than they are to my brother. So, like, how can my brother be a champion of anti-oppression and not just, you know, make me be the person all the time? So look for those places that we are acknowledging and shifting power. Examine your attitudes and actions. So this is, again, a lot more introspection, like, how are you viewing people in your communities? Many years ago, we worked with an organization whose board had proposed a child abuse prevention month campaign of not in our town. And it was a well-intended campaign, but then the response was like, so where are you okay with abuse being? Like, where, like, you don't want it here, but like, where do you want to move it? And that was not the intention of this effort, right? And so, like, look at the ways in which we maybe are unintentionally communicating or upholding through our attitudes different values and norms. And this takes work. Using resources like our Addressing the Root Causes of Violence and Abuse online course can help you do some of this examination. Learning from the communities we work with and within can really be a core piece of this, which leads to the next one of being an active learner. none of us are ever done. None of us are there. We want to keep learning our whole lives. That is a really key part of prevention. So how can we do that? How can we model that learning for others so that we make learning and growing okay? Working to identify isms. Nicole offered some examples of isms in this presentation, but there's so much opportunity to learn more about that and recognize how that is showing up in our work, in our communities, in the spaces that we are in the ways we take up space, in the policies we create, in the policies we don't create. So looking for those places that those isms are showing up and learning from, and actively working to make sure that we're not then reinforcing those isms or like ignoring when those isms show up. And then finally, incorporate programming that directly addresses oppression. Again, this might be you all leading efforts that directly address oppression. This might be supporting efforts in your community that you don't see directly tied to oppression. Things like maybe supporting local community gardens because there's food scarcity and there are food deserts that are impacting or disproportionately impacting certain populations within your communities, right? That might not feel like child abuse prevention, but if we connect all those dots like we talked about in the first recording and we've dove a little bit into here, that we know that is going to create safer and healthier communities for all people and protect against abuse. For this last one of incorporating programming, a great resource to really explore this more and have great lesson plans and other tools, how to talk about hard topics in a classroom or in communities. Learning for Justice is a great resource and we highly recommend it.
Thank you for all those fantastic examples, Meg. Absolutely so useful for thinking about how we can incorporate an anti-oppression framework into our work. And with that, we are going to wrap up episode 2 of our Abuse Prevention 101 series. We would love to see you back here for our third recording, which is going to think about how health promotion is a part of abuse prevention. And if you would like to explore any of these resources further, we highly recommend checking them out. If you have things that you'd like to talk with us about, you can always reach out to us at the task force, and we would be more than happy to connect you with resources or chat with you about your efforts. Thank you so much for listening.